A lot of this will not be made possible without an extremely capable IPI board, and the board members from IPI are here. If board members of IPI, if you can please stand to be recognized. As well as an extremely capable IPI staff. And IPI staff is in the room. Please wave or stand up where you are. I know Stephen was mentioned in the letters. Okay, now I'd like to invite the panelists for the next part of the program to please join me on stage. Anyway. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time doing any deep bios. This is being live streamed. I'd like to invite those who are watching us on the stream to go to ipi.media to look at the bios, and the bios are available in the program for those of IPI members who are here with us. But first, though, in terms of introducing them, I'd like to first introduce Alexandra Borchardt from Süddeutsche Zeitung. She is with Germany's largest circulation newspaper. Let's see, Klaus Brinkbäumer, Klaus with Der Spiegel, Germany. Joan Chirwa, and Joan is with the Mast in Zambia. James Stephenson with the BBC. And Mukund Padmanabhan with the Hindu. So let's start with our conversation, and I also would like to let the audience know that I want this to be very much a conversation, and I'll get the audience involved shortly after a few questions to the panel. So Alex, we'll start with you talking about the future of news and building the journalism we need. There's been so much talk about online journalism, and it's the wave of the future. Why do you think it is not wise to abandon print?
First of all, I don't think it's not wise to abandon quality journalism, because that's what counts. And we deeply believe that it doesn't make that much of a difference if you access journalism via print and paper, or via a digital edition that we sell quite successfully actually, or via just a website. The importance is the quality of the journalism, and that's what we have to cherish and take care of and develop.
Well, why don't I ask that same question to Joan, because Joan is deeply involved in online journalism. Joan, do you think that print should be abandoned?
Definitely not.
You want mine?
Definitely not. We cannot abandon print, because there's still the future in print journalism. If you look at the country where I come from, the biggest numbers of the readership that we get is definitely from the print and the online, because a lot of people haven't yet gotten accustomed to digital journalism or online journalism. There's still a lot of interest, because people want to get a copy of a newspaper every day, something that they can keep even on their shelves and refer to whenever they want to. So it would definitely be a bad idea for us to abandon print just because of the technological advancements that we have seen worldwide.
Let's talk to Klaus. I know that you're with Der Spiegel and you're making really good advancement, certainly in online as well. What about the question about print? I know you, of all people, would definitely hold on to print for as long as you can.
Yeah, and why should you abandon it if you're successful? And so many newspapers around the world, and magazines, of course, too, are successful. And we are selling about close to 800,000 magazines per week. Printed magazines, why should we abandon it? It's still a very successful model. At the same time, you have to, of course, start selling journalism online. We're working on it. Lots of media companies are working on it. Of course, you cannot abandon online journalism as well. You have to be successful wherever you can. And my colleagues already have said it's not about where you publish it, it's about the quality of journalism and then trying to sell it.
Let's go to Asia. Mukund, let's talk about the threats to good quality journalism. What are you seeing, what threats are you facing in India?
Well, I'm a bit skeptical about what online or digital publishing has done to journalism. And I think this quest for speed, or to be a couple of nanoseconds before someone else, this quest to harvest as many eyeballs as you can, I think it's affected the traditional way that journalism is being done. And I think lots of practices, and I think not so very healthy practices have crept into this space. So I'm not sure whether a policy, rather like a startup in any other sector where you just want to get as many customers, as many clients, is a good thing for journalism. I think journalism will get back some of the traction, some of the values that I think it's begun to lose if we succeed, I think, as an enterprise, to make people pay for it online. And then we won't be bothered so much about this mad chase for eyeballs.
James, you're at the BBC, one of the world's largest media houses. How much time do you spend at the BBC worrying about the future of journalism and the threats that the industry faces? And what threats do you see out there when you guys sit down around your conference tables at the BBC to discuss this?
I think it's fair to say we spend quite a lot of time, if not worrying about it, thinking about it. And we've had in the last couple of years 2 big projects. One was a Future of News project that looked out to the industry and tried to examine some of the trends in the way that some other media organizations have tried to do. And then we've had a more internally focused process looking at what our response to that should be. I think it's fair to say we have been in a different space to the newspaper industry, and some of the developments in my professional lifetime have moved in the favor of broadcasters, perhaps against the interests of newspapers. When I was just reflecting, partly thinking of this magnificent hall, which shows a scene of magnificent industrial progress, and I wondered whether the ship in the corner is the refit of a metaphor for the refit of the media industry in the 21st century. But from a lot of my working life, the news, we went from a world in which the news was something you read about that had happened yesterday and appeared in the morning paper that you read the following day, and moved across to a world in which you could get a lot of that information on the same day, courtesy of, not least of, electronic news gathering. And that has accelerated again now with social media. And I think it's accelerated to a point where it now becomes less to the benefit of traditional broadcasters and more of a threat to them. So the social media landscape, the instant information and the partially closed communities of the internet, those are things that are now presenting a challenge certainly to the idea of public service broadcasting, in which you expect to be transmitting information to a broad general audience. So I think that challenge is accelerating as we speak.
Now, the mayor mentioned the proliferation of fake news, something that we all know about. Alex, how much do you think fake news is a threat to journalism, to the survival of journalism long term?
Maybe the discussion about fake news is good for journalism, actually, because it makes it clear that we are really needed to say what's real news, to say that we are the brand who's able to invest in producing real news and finding out about the truth and the way things really are, to explain things, to investigate things. I think this whole debate about fake news has highlighted and emphasized our significance. So, first of all, it's good. Obviously, it's very important to keep up our quality of reporting and to make sure that we don't produce fake news or at least wrong news or sloppily researched news. And I mean, that's what I agree. I don't always agree you have to sacrifice quality for speed. You just have to tell the people where you are. For example, when there's big events, we have this format that I think the New York Times has and many other papers or institutions like that what we know and what we don't know. And I think this, for example, is a very good format because you tell people this is where we are in our research, this is what we know right now, but we don't know more than that, and our reporters are added to do more research on this. And I think that's what you have to do. You have to be fast, but you have to tell people you have to inform them of the stage of your research.
Joan, you are in the online space. Is all this conversation about fake news damaging your brand?
Well, it does in a certain extent, because you find that a lot of this fake news that we get is on social media. It's doing quite a lot of damage to mainstream media, where you have to do a lot of work to counter the fake news. And this is something that really calls for a lot of investment. It doesn't come cheap. There's quite a lot that needs to be put in to fight what is currently going on, because it's quite widespread. You find that by the time the traditional media is going out to disseminate the truth about whatever has gone on, social media will have a lot of the fake stuff that's going around and being shared on different platforms. You even have WhatsApp now that is doing exactly that. So it's quite some challenge, and it's something that we really need to take up and urgently find solutions to it. It will definitely require a lot of involvement, especially amongst ourselves as journalists. What do we do? How do we help each other out in coming up with something that is going to be acceptable? So we don't have to accept anything that comes. We have to find a way of making sure that the news that we have is going to be appreciated by our readers, our listeners, and everybody else that relies on what we disseminate.
Klaus, I want to ask you that there's an election that will be coming up here in a fairly short order. How concerned are you and your colleagues about fake news and other online threats getting into your reporting, and what are you doing to prevent that from happening?
I'm not too concerned about fake news making it into Der Spiegel, because we really have a good system of fact-checking and editing. That doesn't mean it cannot happen. Of course it can, but it shouldn't, and we really try to protect our reporting and to be as responsible as we can. So not really. Fake news or the debate about fake news is keeping us busy. There are so many readers who constantly write letters to me. Today there was one reader who sent 15 emails in 1 hour just to claim, well, this was false and that was false and that was false, and it wasn't. But I had to find a way, and it's every day, to respond or not to respond. So it's a debate that's ongoing, and every news organization has to find ways to, well, engage with readers and interact with readers, and then protect their way to do journalism, and that keeps us busy. That's new, but I actually like it. I like the public debate, and I like these changes. They are challenging, but they're good for journalism. I mean, the New York Times and the Washington Post prove it. They are really relevant these days. They've raised their subscriptions. People are subscribing to the New York Times in huge numbers, so the debate is not too bad for media.
Mukund, what are you seeing in Asia when it comes to all this talk about fake news? I mean, is that a problem there?
Well, it is. I mean, yeah. Well, we've had issues and controversies about fake news, but like Alexandra said, I'm not worried, or like you said, I'm not worried about my newspaper and whether we're going to be stuck with a fake news problem. It's somebody else's problem, really. What worries me is not so much fakeness, but the growing acceptance of inaccuracy in the online space. And this is infecting some publications, and it's infecting the way some journalists have begun to think. And I'll give you an example, just one example of this. Say clickbait headlines. I mean, now the journalists being taught to write clickbait headlines. But by definition, a clickbait headline is something that's just there to grab your attention. Doesn't matter if it's not exactly accurate. It just needs to, draw you into the story. Sometimes it has no relation to the story at all. So I think we're getting into, inaccuracies worry me more, and rather than complete fakeness. And that was a point I was trying to make, that sometimes speed and this urge to sort of reach out and try and get, more readers or more eyeballs, I think, engender practices which are not very healthy in my view. And I think headlines are just one part of it, there are others as well. But
James, let me ask you about something involving what a lot of people would see as a threat to journalism, namely autocratic leaders around the world. We've had a lot of stories, and we talked a lot about Turkey. From your perch at the BBC, when you look at what your correspondents are doing around the world, how much of a role do you think these governments are playing in your ability to get just any news at all out of some of these countries?
I think it is a very big problem, and I think it's a growing problem. I can't speak personally to it in the way that perhaps Joan is sort of better able to, but I think from the position of the organisation as a whole, we look increasingly around the world at places where we want to report from and find that we can't, or that we're heavily restricted. And so, and that trend appears to be developing. So it's got more and more dangerous to report from Syria. We had and don't have a bureau in Iran. We have an office, but no correspondent is given credentials in Iran. We have difficulties with the lèse-majesté laws in Thailand. These pressures are developing. We've heard very movingly about the situation in Turkey, which I think everyone agrees is moving in a very, very troubling direction. And so as you look around the world, and we're actually in the process of launching a dozen new language services, partly in response to this, what we think is this increasing appetite for impartial news around the globe. But as we look to do that, it faces very, very heavy challenges, and the list goes on. Russia has become a more difficult place in the last decade. That's before you even go to talking about places like North Korea. So I think there is a definite problem and a growing problem, and I think rather to the point that the mayor raised, autocrats are emboldened by seeing the success of these kind of practices in restricting journalism in other parts of the world, and if we're not careful, that contagion looks like it might continue.
Well, let me ask that directly of Joan. Joan, in Zambia, the last time I visited you in Zambia, you were literally operating off the sidewalk because the government had closed down your media house and literally kicked you guys out of the building. So you guys did an extremely brave thing by taking the equipment out to the sidewalk and setting up a newsroom there. What kind of threats you see from these autocratic leaders?
Sadly, it's something that can become a very huge problem if we don't stand up and speak out. It starts slowly. Even for a country like Zambia, this is something that we never ever thought was going to happen not long ago. It all happened, you wake up, you find that the newspaper that you work for has been closed on flimsy grounds where they had to come up with something and they had to claim the company was owing taxes. But that was not true because it has been seen as a threat. From Zambia, something else is going to happen, which is so similar. And it already happened because in Malawi, if you remember, there was a newspaper that was closed based on similar issues of taxes. But fortunately for them, the government changed their position and they had to reopen. So it's something that we really, really need to stand up for and speak against and make sure their voices are louder and very loud enough that whatever happens, the journalists around the world are going to stand and say no to this intimidation that is going on. What happened in Zambia is unacceptable and should never ever happen anywhere else. What's happening in Turkey is totally unacceptable and should never ever continue. And no autocratic regime should be given chance to continue what they are doing. And that cannot come from anywhere else but ourselves as journalists. If we don't do it, there's definitely not going to be anybody else who's going to speak for us. So it's a big problem, and they will not stop. They just never stop, because at the end of the day, all these autocratic regimes want to win, and they always want to put us at a receiving end where you just receive whatever they throw to you and say, fine, we're going to do it because we want to survive. But we have to weigh the options. Survival by going for whatever they are asking us to do is definitely a no, because the bigger issue for us is to serve the masses. We have to speak for the public. What does society want? What do they want to hear? Do we want to please the people that are in power? That should not be our role. It's definitely not our role. And that's how we're going to safeguard independent journalism that is slowly being killed all over the world. Wherever you look, there's definitely some threats here and there.
Let me ask the panel, how do you think the media should respond to someone like Trump? I know the mayor did not mention the name, but certainly some of the things that he said gives the implication that of what's happening in the United States. Whoever wants to address that, how do you think that the media should respond to some of the things that Trump is saying and doing?
I'm happy to kick
you want
that
to do
off.
James?
Yeah. So you asked me about things we think and worry about. This is something we think and worry about. So I think, first of all, we should nod our hats to the, as has already been mentioned, to the New York Times and the Washington Post, because they're doing something really seriously impressive, which is that they're doing their job in the face of, let's call it intimidation, because that's what it is, political intimidation. So that's the first thing, is to do the reporting. I think where it becomes, and we're attempting to do that too, and we have correspondents looking at what is quite a daunting array of lines, of leads that we might pursue. And I know my colleagues here, I was looking at the Trump files in your publications, and that other people are doing that too. I think there's another thing just worth touching on, though, which is something we've talked about, which is certainly from a BBC perspective, we are not the opposition. We are not the political opposition to Donald Trump or indeed to other politicians. And so our role is scrutiny, calling to account, pursuit of the truth above all. I think that the temptation to tip over into a sort of oppositional stance is something that you can see happening in some instances, I think, in the American media. But that's what we're attempting to do, and it may not be good in other ways, but it's certainly good for the news business, the Trump administration.
No, I want to, Alex, while you address that question, I see Devan Maharaj in the audience. He is the editor-in-chief and publisher of the LA Times. I'd like, Devan, if you would please come forward, because I want you to talk about some of the things that you did, that your newspaper did with regard to Trump. But Alex, please, why don't you continue, and then we'll get to Devan.
Yeah, I think that was one important point, not to be a party, not to be the opposition. But the other point I find important is also not to over-report, and it's very hard to strike a good balance, because the more you report, the more this is getting the new normal. And I think that was a problem during the election, during the campaigns, actually, because it was Trump was such a funny figure for journalists that he was basically pictured in newspapers all over every day, because, oh, look at what he said, look at what he... So we did this analysis at Süddeutsche Zeitung, and actually apart from Angela Merkel, no single person was pictured as much in the newspaper in the last year as Donald Trump. And remember, the campaign, I mean, the election was in November, so we only started this by the end of the year. So if you have this to be the new normal, then people suddenly feel, oh, it can't be all that bad. Oh, yeah, he's just this strange guy who says, you know, erroneous things. And that's really been a problem. How do you report and dig deep, but do not over-report? And I think that's a challenge media face today.
Klaus, I think you want to get into this, but before you do, let me ask Devan, a strange guy who does strange things?
Well, like the New York Times and the Washington Post, we also have been covering the administration pretty aggressively with news stories and analysis. But recently, our editorial board decided that we had seen enough. Instead of wait 100 days to analyze the Trump presidency as is tradition, we decided that there was enough evidence that Trump was a threat to American democracy. He was attacking institutions that Americans had taken, more than 200 years to build, and we were losing our standing, our moral standing in the world. John, when we were in the German government office yesterday, it was clear that was the situation, as we were lobbying the German government to stand up for journalists in Turkey, in Ethiopia, and against the slaughter of journalists in Mexico. So my colleagues on the editorial board decided that we needed to articulate what was wrong with this administration. So we wrote a 6-part series, and this was editorial, not news, a 6-part series called The Problem with Trump. And I have, with your permission, I'll read the first 5 graphs. So they said it was time to, it was time to denounce Trump's lies, his authoritarian temperament, and his war on journalists. And so this is how it started. The first in the series, which was titled "Our Dishonest President." I have to admit, I had a hand in writing that. It was no secret during the campaign that Donald Trump was a narcissist and a demagogue who used fear and dishonesty to appeal to the worst in American voters. The Times called him unprepared and unsuited for the job he was seeking, and said his election would be a catastrophe. Still, nothing prepared us for the magnitude of this train wreck. Like millions of other Americans, we clung to a slim hope that the new president would turn out to be all noise and bluster, or that the people around him in the White House would act as a check on his worst instincts, or that he would be sobered and transformed by the awesome responsibilities of office. Instead, some 70 days in, and with about 1,400 to go before his term is completed, it is increasingly clear that those hopes were misplaced. In a matter of weeks, President Trump has taken dozens of real life steps that, if they are not reversed, will rip families apart, foul rivers and pollute the air, intensify the calamitous effects of climate change, and profoundly weaken the system of American public education for all. His attempt to de-insure millions of people who had finally received healthcare coverage, and along the way enact a massive transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich, has been put on hold for the moment. But he is proceeding with efforts to defang the government's regulatory agencies and blow the Pentagon's budget. The last paragraph I'll get to. What is most worrisome about Trump is Trump himself. He is a man so unpredictable, so reckless, so petulant, so full of blind self-regard, so untethered to reality that it's impossible to know where his presidency will lead or how much damage he will do to our nation. his obsession with his own fame, wealth, and success, his determination to vanquish enemies real and imagined, his craving for adulation, those traits were, of course, at the heart of his scorched earth outsider campaign. Indeed, some of them helped him get him elected, as Alexandra said. But in a real presidency in which he wields unimaginable power, they are nothing short of disastrous.
Thank you, Devon. Let's go to Klaus. I know you wanted to make a comment on Trump, please. And if there are other questions in the audience, please raise your hand and I'll come to you in a minute. Okay.
Just very briefly, because most things have already been said, I don't think the problem is over-reporting. I think the problem was that Trump wasn't really taken seriously before the election, that he was being treated as an entertainment star, and reporting like the one about the connections with Russia would have been possible before the election. The media have to be relentless and not stop reporting. They shouldn't get tired. They shouldn't lose their intensity, and let's leave it with that.
Okay. One question or comment from the audience?
My name is Daoud Kuttab. I was arrested both by the Israelis and the Palestinians for my journalistic work. And in 1997, when I was arrested, Mike McCurry, the spokesman of the White House, spoke out on my behalf, and I was released. And so when Trump was elected and he started attacking the press, I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying, when America was great, people in the White House spoke out for press freedom. And I was wondering whether this is going to continue. Actually, today I feel a bit more comfortable because I feel the journalists in America have stood up for the First Amendment and they are fighting for their own right to speak out.
Thank you. Mukund, do you want to address that whole issue of what happens when you're arrested, whether the government or even anyone in the government speaks out? What's the situation in India in terms of journalist rights?
Yeah, before that, if I may just briefly, just a line about the Trump issue. I would, be in sympathy personally with a lot of things that were said in that read out article. But my worry would be, what do we pick and choose? How much has this wall between news and opinion got collapsed as a result of this? And I think this is possibly has happened in America as well, where people have taken lines and this distinction between news and opinion, which probably was there in some way, has sort of got dissolved, if you like. And I think that's worrying, one aspect of this Trump phenomenon. Your question was about arrests and so on. I don't think we've had a huge issue in my country with journalists. We've had journalists being attacked. I was reading a number the other day that there were 146 attacks on journalists in the last, between 2014 and 15. That happens, but we don't have a Turkey-like issue, where people are put away. So I don't think we suffer from that. We've have people. The use of laws, often used to threaten people, sedition laws, not necessarily journalists alone, but others, writers, artists. We have some sections in the Indian Penal Code which, are almost like hate speech provisions, which are then used saying, you've offended my sentiments, religious or otherwise. So I think these have a chilling effect sometimes on perhaps journalists and other thinkers, writers, and so on. Yeah.
I know that we'll be losing the mayor soon, and Mr. Mayor, I just want to thank you again for your powerful address at the beginning and for being with us, and also for the hospitality of the city of Hamburg. I wanted to, and mention that because the mayor will be leaving soon. Joan, I wanted to get your suggestion or your recommendation for American journalists who are now dealing with a situation that somewhat may not be as extreme, but that you and your colleagues have been dealing with for quite some time. as it relates to threats from the government?
My recommendation would be they should continue doing what they know best, and that is to bring out the truth, regardless of who is in that position. It doesn't matter who they are, whether president or whatever, because even the president has to be accountable to the people. He is not president of himself. He's the president of all the American citizens, so they have to stand strong and continue doing that which is right. Then quickly, just my little comment on the same Trump presidency. It's something that has become like big news everywhere, and we do follow it a lot, even in Zambia. Our fear is, how are the Americans out there representing their countries going to speak on press freedom? For instance, the American ambassador in Zambia, how is he going to stand up today and defend press freedom in Zambia when there's so much that's going on in his own country and his own government? It's become a very difficult situation. They have been put in an extremely awkward position because someone is going to stand up and say, you are saying that about Zambia. What is your president doing in America? So it's ultimately a very big problem for them because they can't. There's so much going on right now, and the American ambassador can't speak. Because obviously for him, all those things are going to happen. Maybe a representative of the Zambian government is even going to call and remind him, how do you blow a horn in our country when you've got your own issues, you've got so much that you have to clean up? So those are the things that really are happening. It may look like, well, maybe it's just an American problem, but definitely it's a big problem. And others are going to use it. And if you look at America, I think it's been a very good example when it comes to press freedom. It's been a model, I would say, where everyone will look out and say, this is a place where every journalist would want to be because there's freedom, they can do whatever they want. Then within a blink of an eye, everything just changes. It's a very serious cause for worry.
Let me ask, I see that, Mukund, were you going to make a point? Okay. I see that we have John Daniszewski in the audience, and John, of course, this was totally unplanned. Please, thanks for being with us. John is also on the board of the North American Committee, and we're talking about what's happening in the States. Do you have a comment in terms of how the U.S. press is dealing with Trump?
Yes, I think the U.S. press has really been reinvigorated by the challenge posed by some of the anti-press statements made by President Trump. And I think it's animating good investigative journalism. I think after a period of sort of getting its balance, there does seem to be a really strong effort being made to return to our journalistic roots, dig out verifiable facts, and keep the reporting going. And that, I think, is why people are so excited again to log on to newspaper websites or to follow the news online or in the AP or in other ways. It really is a different mood in the media in the States now. But I would sort of like to echo what our colleague from India said. We really need to keep opinion and facts separate, and we need to keep opinions on the editorial page and just practice aggressive, fair, fact-based, verifiable journalism.
I noticed that since we're talking, and this is the last question or probably comment on Trump, I wanted to bring in Marty Stephenson. Marty is the chair of the North American Committee, and Marty and her colleagues in the U.S. have been dealing with this issue. Marty, what advice are you giving your colleagues there?
Do great journalism. Be able to do like the New York Times is doing, which is to say how we came to the conclusion that we're coming. In other words, do exceptional journalism. Don't just quote one anonymous source, quote 9 anonymous sources. So in other words, it's refocusing us on the principles of great journalism. And I think that's a lesson for all of us, is that we can't take freedom of the press for granted. We have to earn it every day, and that's what we're doing, is earning it every day. I was reading the New York Times today and really rediscovering how they put together a journalistic news story, brick by brick. It's like all good lessons. When you are in a hurricane, build a great structure. That's what we're doing.
Thank you, Marty. Any comment by any member of the... Oh.
I just wanted to build on that, but move away from Trump, if you're happy
Absolutely,
about that. Just to say that in a wider sphere, I think we're seeing a resurgence of classic journalism, and partly what I have in mind is some of this, it's being done on a new model, and people are probably familiar with the work of the consortium of the ICIJ, not least Süddeutsche Zeitung, who had the original dump of the Panama Papers, and then it led to this extraordinary collaboration of, I think it was 100 media organizations, including the BBC across 80 countries. And it produced really compelling journalism, and it struck me coming here that German journalism is having a very strong period. So ARD's reporting on doping in sport and where that's led to with the Russians, and I think Der Spiegel was very heavily involved in the Snowden process, collaborating with The Guardian in the UK. So we're seeing, not just in America, we're seeing a real resurgence in classic investigative journalism, but done in a new model, conscious not least of the fact that we're moving into this world where data journalism is becoming much more central, and it's a pretty daunting prospect for any media organization to be confronted with 11 million documents. We all know what to do with one document. We're not so sure with 11 million, and I think we're seeing a new world opening up there. The business model perhaps is not, the answers aren't quite so clear, but some of the editorial practice is really advancing in the 21st century in a way that we haven't seen before.
Alex, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yes, because I think, well, obviously he's right, and I'm glad he mentioned the Panama Papers, so I wouldn't have to do it. Exactly. No, but I think as Germany, we actually have a responsibility to step in, because, America helped us build our post-World War democracy and our strong institutions, and turns out that, our strong institutions, our press here is very strong now, and it was not in vain that someone called Angela Merkel leader of the free world when Trump was elected, and they said, okay, now she has to run again. I think we as Germans and also as Europeans, we have a responsibility to speak up once when the American ambassador is not able to really speak up for freedom of the press because he can't resort to his country as an example, then, well, we should.
James, you raised a really good point about when you brought up the Panama Papers. If we're talking about the future of journalism, I mean, what should we do in terms of creating alliances such as what came out of the Panama Papers? I'd like to get from the panel, what have you seen, if there are unique projects that you're doing at your respective media houses to really get at that question? How can we work more effectively together? You can go first, Klaus.
We can cooperate, and that's, I can speak for Der Spiegel. It has been very new for us because we've never really shared information we had gotten with partners. And if you look at football leagues, which we just did a couple of months ago, we had the original material and shared it with our partners from the EIC, which is the investigative network all across Europe that we built up. And trusting partners and sharing information with them so everybody can contribute and make the whole project stronger, that's new. And it was completely new to our mentality because investigative reporters at Der Spiegel always kept their sources to themselves and their information to themselves, and they didn't really want to trust the people next door. So why trust a news organization somewhere else in Europe? But we do now, and that's really making Der Spiegel stronger, and it's making everybody else stronger. The Panama Papers was a huge journalistic effort around the world. And that's very new to journalism, and so I don't really see anything threatening journalism, except maybe losing advertisement. Yes, we have to save money here and there, but there are much more chances and opportunities for everybody.
Alex?
Yeah, I think that's the big challenge actually, because we have eroding business models, financing by advertising, and at the same time we have a huge need to invest in technology. And you can't do it just on your own. And so that's the major reason for cooperation, except in fact, this is not only a thing for the media industry, this is across all industries that different companies who were competitors before, even in the auto industry, in the manufacturing, they start to cooperate because with data journalism coming up, or with digitization in general, it's not possible for any single company to really do the whole thing on their own. So it really needs to, this investment really needs some major effort. And then also we have the big platform businesses who actually contribute a lot to our eroding business models, talking about Facebook and Google. And so we as media organizations have to stick together and pool our resources to stand up and make sure that we have our technology right, we have our data right, and we can put something against that dominance. That's very important for the future of media.
By the way, is there anyone in the audience from Facebook or Google? I think I had seen some had registered earlier. We have a question.
Thank you. I'm Anita from The Week magazine, India. I agree completely that good journalism, there has been a great resurgence. I would like to just move a bit from the journalism ecosystem to wider society. And I frankly was disappointed that more heads did not roll after the Panama Papers. Edward Snowden is still a fugitive. So are we working in some kind of a situation where the deliverables are not there? That is not in our hands, for sure. But we are part of a system where the rest of society, politicians and parliamentarians, should be taking the steps. That doesn't seem to be happening. More political heads should have rolled, did not. So I would like your comments as to what do we do in this disappointing situation?
Alex, should more heads have rolled?
Well, I think it's a good thing we have a separation of powers, and actually the courts are the ones that have to deal with all these things. I mean, journalists can do research, can investigate, can discover things, but then everybody deserves the fair treatment, the court of law, and that's what other institutions are meant to solve, actually, or parliaments or whatever. I mean, we have several powers. We have a separation of powers, and that's then checks and balances, and that's a good thing, actually. So media is not taking people to court.
Another question from the audience.
Louis Sanders, Deutsche Welle. My question concerns fake news because, for example, you have Trump calling, the New York Times fake news, and I was wondering, from your perspective, how do you engage this critique from maybe parts of the audience that would dub, let's say, mainstream media as fake news? How do you approach that? Do you engage with them? I would love to hear your approach.
Let's start with Joan. Joan, I suspect that a number of people from the president's party call your reporting fake news.
Yes, they do. It's quite a big challenge, but obviously you can't get derailed by a few who also have their own agenda. They look at you in a different way, but they know definitely that what you're doing is correct. But they have to take a certain position or a certain stance just to support what they believe in, and they call you all sorts of names. But for the Trump situation, I think it's something that you can't totally ignore because it's coming from somebody who holds the highest position of that country. The best that the New York Times should do is to continue on the same path, that is bringing out the news as it's supposed to be told. And also, of course, not forgetting the fact that we have to do a lot of background work, a lot of research, and making sure that what we have is the truth And whatever happens, if somebody calls it fake, someone can easily get back to check from the other sources and then verify the facts that you have. And they'll be able to tell that what you have is the correct news and it's not fake news. But it's a big challenge for media, but that should never, ever put us in a position where we feel we have to do something to make that person that calls our news fake news to stop and start saying that we have the correct news because that's what they want to hear or that's what they want to see.
Mukund, fake news at the Hindu?
I don't know about the Hindu, but as far as the question went about Trump and the New York Times, I think in a free society, or at least in a society where paper is not going to get intimidated by this, I think you should wear that as a badge of honor. And I think the same is true of maybe politicians in India attacking or at least these broadsides. It's another thing to point out one factual mistake or to address a specific issue in a sort of granular and particular fashion. But if someone is just going to tar you with a broad brush and very unfairly, then I think you're probably doing something right. So I would take heart from the attack, and I would think the New York Times should do that as well from an attack like this.
James, did you want to get in here?
Yes, just to say I think it's a very good question in a very large area, and it breaks down into different parts. I mean, I think as it were, classical fake news, Macedonian generation of stories to generate advertising on social media, that is a problem, but it's a containable problem and needs to be addressed. I think the answer for conventional media is to be trusted, and we build trust over time and we lose it very easily. So we need to build and maintain that trust. I think there is an increasing focus on the obligations of the social media platforms themselves. Certainly in my country, and I think it's true elsewhere, they're having to think very carefully about and respond to very serious public pressure now, which says it's not good enough to just say you're a carrier for information and have no responsibility for the content. And I think I can only see that debate and that focus growing, and I think it's right that scrutiny should be there. So I think it's quite a complicated package of things, depending on exactly what you're talking about. But it does seem to be the challenge of our times. And as was mentioned earlier, we're concluding that we have to move into the more forcefully into the fact-checking, debunking area of journalism, and we have this reality check team that we're building that can look, for example, at the kind of things that the Russians were attempting to do in the French election, allegedly the American election, allegedly the German election. They don't seem to be that interested in the British election, but maybe that's news hasn't broken yet.
As someone would say, you just wait. I see the editor-in-chief of the Daily Pratham from Bangladesh is here, and we're talking about how you deal with reporting when the government, quite frankly, is not crazy about what you're doing. I know you've had to face a lot of that in Bangladesh. How do you deal with it?
Well, I would like to echo the feelings that other journalists have expressed, that as Churchill said, that all the deficiencies of democracy can only be solved by more democracy. So all the pressures that we have on journalism can only be solved by more and more good, well-researched, ethical journalism. I think I echo the comment made by my American colleague there, that when in a storm you may build a strong house. So we are now under storm. We need to build a strong ethical journalistic house. But I would like to mention one thing, that I think this is also, we are under pressure from all over the world. Journalism in Bangladesh and in Philippines, in many other countries, India, I think also in various ways. So this is the time for us to really introspect. I think as much as the external world is sort of trying to pressurize us with fake news or with false accusations, but I think this is a moment also which journalists need to introspect. I think we became at some stage self-righteous, we became arrogant, we deviated from the fundamental principles of public service, upholding, if you like, rights and freedoms of minorities, of people, disadvantaged people. Whatever the original purpose of journalism was, I think we deviated. We became overconfident, we became lazy, and also I think we gave in too much to advertisers, too much to vested interests of the owners of the press. So public lost interest. Let us admit freely that when we are accused of bad journalism, why do certain section of people believe it? Is it just because they're against the free press? I don't think so. We faltered in the last 2-3 decades, and that also needs to be addressed at this moment of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahfouz. We just have maybe 2 minutes left, and I apologize. I called you the editor of the Daily Star. That I gave you, of the Portamalo, gave you another job. You're actually at the Daily Star. Could you please, if you can make a really quick comment, so that there's one more comment to come, and then we'll have to wrap.
Thank you. That's more a question probably to the ladies and gentlemen sitting on the white chairs there, and to possibly will be one of the lines of our discussion here in the upcoming days. I'm Alex Bobrovnikov from Ukraine. The thing is that the big whales of journalism are speaking about the social media and the Facebook and Twitter still as some alternative platform as it is, and with the context of alternative being sometimes fake, it's also a language problem, but still it doesn't look like we are moving towards a more integrated platforms with the more kind of audience participation and pieces we are doing. In my knowledge, for instance, let Mr. Snowden, if he hears us, excuse me for that, but for instance, FBI is doing it, and is doing it right now. Shan't we kind of look at that a bit more attentively, should I say? Thank you, Danke.
Thank you very much. Now, we are just about out of time, but I promise to take one final question from this gentleman. Please, if you would get up and say who you are. And
yes. My name is Lois Lamahu. I was a photojournalist for about 25 years before I became a book publisher, and I'm not so happy with the discussion here. It's too uncritical to ourselves. Only the second last statement was fulfilling my expectations of this discussion. I think we created Trump. We created this special figure in politics by letting it happen that news have become commodities. And this has to do with the fact that media houses are having become big enterprises which are about to do profits. And I think that the media did run after Trump so much, had the effect that we have him. If this wouldn't have been the case, that it was so interesting, so entertaining to listen to this man, he wouldn't be here. I'm pretty sure about that. This wouldn't have happened. Secondly, and this is the structural problem in journalism, we work with a lot of freelancing people who are in really difficult economic situations. They are forced to do journalistic work under circumstances which are not causing the results we need to have in good journalism, because they have worked too much with copy and paste. They are forced to deliver results within a very short period of time. And I think the third subtopic to address, in my opinion, would be that news have become more local. We know much less of our world than I did know, let's say, 25 years ago. Take a newspaper, what we had then, it was the International Herald Tribune. I could, in brief, at least get some information what's going on around the world. Now we look to the belly bottom of Central Europe and the Western Hemisphere, US, Canada, but this is basically it, what we are looking at. I mean, the internet is opening up the window so that I can go on myself to look to news from New Zealand, Australia, etc. on a daily basis. But if I would go with print press, I would not find it. I would not find it, simply not find it.
Thank you very much. I'm glad we were able to get your comment in. Unfortunately, we are out of time, and I'm getting a hard wrap from Milica. Thank you. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel for this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'd like now to invite former IPI Vice Chair, Mr. Simon Lee, to the podium for some awards.